afternoon, and welcome to the final session of our symposium. And for those who have been with us all day, I hope you've enjoyed all of your sessions thus far. I am Dr. Candace Alfred Weber. I serve as Chief of Partnerships at the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children. If you are just joining us, I do want to just mention a few housekeeping items if this is your first session that you've been able to attend. So you can chat directly with our speaker for today or myself in the chat box if you're having any tech problems. You can chat me directly. If you have any questions, just type them in the Q&A box or the chat. So I'll be monitoring both. And so we should have time for Q&A at the end. And so throughout the presentation this afternoon, please, just add your questions as we go along. And so let's get into this last session of the day. We are joined by Dr. Danica Brown. She is the founder of DL Research Solutions. She's an experienced researcher based in New Orleans, Louisiana. She partners with organizations to transform data into meaningful community impact through mixed methods evaluation and consulting. With expertise across education, youth programs, and community health, she supports capacity building, sustainability, and equity-centered decision-making. Dr. Brown's work spans the Gulf South and beyond, helping organizations navigate challenges and drive systems change with a focus on educational justice and community empowerment. And so without further ado, I am going to welcome and turn it over to Dr. Brown to take us right into our session this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you all today. And thanks, Candace, for that warm introduction. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. And so today in the session, I just want to share some early insights and lessons learned from the first year of implementation of the Louisiana Early Educator Investment Collaborative. And so some background about this project. We are evaluating the Louisiana EEIC projects, and I'm just here to sort of share a little bit about lessons learned, but also frame this project within a systems change approach. And so as we think about how local entities are helping to shape and helping to improve early educator compensation, I just want to sort of frame the conversation around systems change, define what systems change is, and sort of dive deep into how we view this as a systems change effort. And so the first, just want to share a little bit of background about the Louisiana EEIC. And so some of the projects, and so we call them demonstration projects, and there are 7 projects, and I'll go through that and show you what each project is. But the main goal of the EEIC is just to pilot these local strategies to improve educator pay. And so some of the strategies are around improving benefits. Some of them are around leveraging local funding, coordinating benefits, establishing workforce training partnerships. So the strategies are slightly different and they cover various parts of the state. So we have some strategies spanning from urban, suburban, and rural parishes in Louisiana, with business coaching or mentoring that goes across parishes in Louisiana. We also have some researchers that are working on benefits and wages to provide some insight into policy and advocacy strategies around benefits and wages in an urban parish. We also have a suburban and rural parish that's working on designing and implementing a benefits package that'll provide some support to centers and provide them some support around how to implement these benefits and wages and how to use existing funding streams to improve the benefits of their teachers. And then the third strategy is a fourth strategy that a suburban parish is working on is conducting focus groups with early educators. A fifth strategy is a millage campaign to improve wages and for lower income families. Another strategy addressed early educator pay through school readiness tax credits and provided teachers with stipends based on school readiness tax credits. And finally, one parish worked on a compensation package, which included also working on an in-house CDA training program and then communications campaigns to sort of educate the public around early childhood education. So these projects focused on various types of strategies in various parts of the state. And so our data collection as evaluators on the project, we collected various sources of data, mainly qualitative data. So we interviewed all of the project leaders, steering committee members, those whose voices were represented in developing and implementing the project. And then we also held focus groups as necessary with different providers and directors and teachers that were affiliated with different projects. We observed meetings, which included a community of practice meetings, demonstration project advisory meetings, and then we also hold check-ins with the demonstration project leaders. And this included initial meetings, quarterly check-ins, and then other informal check-ins through email, et cetera, just to get updates on their projects. And finally, we analyzed and reviewed research and relevant project documents to inform this analysis. And then we did a quantitative analysis of expense reports in terms of how the funds were used to support their project in terms of improving educator pay. And so our analysis, our approach to analysis was a mixed methods approach. So we examined both types of data. First, we examined the data separately, and then we examined the data together to give a more holistic picture of how projects were implementing their strategies, and not just how they're implementing their strategies, but how their strategies are developed and how they're thinking about the progress of improving educator pay in their parishes. So we collected and analyzed both qualitative and quantitative data for the first year of the project. And we're also underway in the second year of the project, and we will be collecting additional qualitative and quantitative data to inform our analysis. And so I wanted to give that background to sort of give a little bit of background about what we've, as evaluators, have been working on. But this particular presentation will focus on these three guiding questions. And so we wanted to, in our learning in year one, we sort of came together and thought about all of the work that the different projects were doing and framed it as a systems change issue, because we can all agree that early educator pay requires so many different actors to be involved, so many levels of the system. And so these three questions guide our presentation. So the first is, what is systems change in early educator compensation? And sometimes we use these terms, but we don't define them or get on the same page about what we mean in terms of systems change. The second question that guides this presentation is, why is early educator compensation a systems change issue? So we'll grapple with that in this presentation. And finally, how do we build local capacity for systems change in early educator compensation? And so we're going to use some lessons learned from the first year of implementation of the Louisiana Early Educator Investment Collaborative. So the first question, what is systems change in early educator compensation? So to ground this conversation, we developed this definition based on our learnings from the Louisiana EEIC. And so our analysis in year one led us to dig deeper into ECE pay as a systems change issue. And this is the lens through which we evaluate the project, and also the lens through which we view this work. So we defined the systems change as understanding and addressing the root causes of pay inequity through a collaborative cross-sector approach that builds state and local capacity to create sustainable wage structures for early educators. And so with this in mind, it's important to recognize that systems change is both a dynamic process and it's an outcome. And so when we think of systems change as a dynamic process and outcome, we can sort of visualize it in this way. So we can see the entire ECE system is impacted by multiple levels and multiple contexts. We see federal agencies, state agencies, and organizations. We have communities, local businesses, parents, we have the child care centers, and most importantly, our children. And then the early educator is at the heart of this matter of educator pay. And so in order to raise educator pay, we have to work at all levels of the system. It is complex, and each level of the system also has its own system of organizational structures and practices and capacities that have to be considered. So this work is very contextual, and it requires a different lens to sort of look and really dig deep at the strategies on the ground. And so our second question, why is early educator compensation a systems change issue? And so when we think about this question, we need to think about what it requires to sustainably increase educator pay. And so as we dug deep as researchers into this question, and as we dug deep into different frameworks that sort of help us to think about how the projects are being enacted on the ground, we asked ourselves, what are the conditions for systems change to occur? And so one framework that arose was this particular framework that looks at systems change from three different perspectives. And so the first is structural change, and that's more explicit policies and practices and resource flows. And those sort of things are where systems change typically occurs, because there's a a particular path where policies and practices and resources flows are enacted. And those are pretty explicit. And then the second level of systems change is relational change, which is a little less explicit. So in this framework, it's semi-explicit. And so within that, you have your relationships and your connections and your power dynamics. And we often take this particular level for granted when we think about research or evaluation. We don't think about how do we really evaluate or how do we learn more about our relationships? How do we create relational change so that we can create this third level of system change, which is transformative change, which is implicit. And so this framework really helps us to sort of ground the work that the Louisiana Early Educator Investment Collaborative that they're doing, and it helps us to sort of understand as evaluators how this change and how their work towards change is happening on the ground. And so in sum, ECE compensation is definitely a system change issue. We all can agree because large scale improvement requires change within and across the systems, as I've shown on the previous diagram. It also requires multi-level strategies. And then one thing that we want to talk about today is it requires strategic investment in multiple types of capacity. And so when we think about investment, we think about money, but there's multiple ways to improve the capacity or build the capacity of multiple key actors in your system towards developing systems thinking and systems change. And finally, it involves continuous learning and improvement across the system. So as strategies are being implemented, as learning is happening, it requires reflection and it requires documentation to understand what's working and what is not working. Finally, how do we build capacity for systems change and early educator compensation on the local level? And so I'll turn now to what we've been learning from the on-the-ground efforts to improve educator pay. So one of our key learnings from year one is that multiple types of capacity is needed to move the needle on educator pay locally. So to build that capacity for systems change is for state and other actors to build this sort of ecosystem of capacity. And when we think about an ecosystem, we think about the various sort of living organisms and non-living organisms in the environment that sustain life for everyone involved. And so it basically means that we need to think at every level of the system, how can we create change? Who are the key actors involved? How do we develop partnerships that are meaningful to improving educator pay? How can we build system expertise in terms of building systems thinking around how to improve this issue, developing leaders in the system, and then also approaches that are complementary that will help to move the needle short-term, long-term, and maybe intermediate in terms of this issue. And so this ecosystem is built upon the foundation of these 6 conditions that I have listed here. And they're also built on the foundation of structural change, relational change, and transformative change. And so I'll take a look at each. Now I'll sort of take a look at each of these principles and connect them to different kinds of capacity and also show some examples in practice from the demonstration projects. So leadership development is the first particular principle of systems change, and building the capacity of system leaders at all levels is critical. And so what we've learned here is that identifying leaders and building systems to support their development is key to systems change in early educator pay. And so an example in practice is the Louisiana EEIC community of practice. And so in this community of practice, they convene the demonstration project leaders and they provide support, education on different areas based on the needs of the demonstration project leaders. They also provide an opportunity for collaboration and feedback across the different parishes on their strategies. And other opportunities to develop leadership among the projects is peer support, and then an intentional focus on identifying those specific actions and activities that are most conducive to advancing systems change in ECE pay. And so that peer support, those relational aspects of working with peers and working across different systems really provide the foundation for systems change in early educator pay. And so the second condition or principle of systems change is organizational capacity. And so building the capacity, supporting the operations of the different parish leaders to provide room and time to focus on piloting these strategies was key. And so documenting this learning towards improving pay was really also important. And so one example is just the Policy Institute providing that funding capacity to carry out the work, but not just providing the funding capacity, but also the relationships, connecting the different parish leaders to others that can help them move their work forward. And so that provided consultants, researchers, and other relational resources that helped the projects to progress. Third, complementary approaches. So using a full range of strategies and approaches is critical to systems change. So working at one level of the system in one way will not create systems change. There must be a full range of strategies and approaches. And so looking at the Louisiana EEIC, the different strategies that I presented earlier, they focus on intermediate or long-term approaches. They also target compensation strategies at multiple levels for impact on state policy well as local practices to improve compensation. And then they're informed by local and national research. So they're grounded in prior research. And finally, all of the projects were centering Black and Brown educators' experiences, needs, and priorities um, as the most critical piece of improving educator pay. And so when we think about systems change as grounded in sort of this relational transformative approach, we can think about equitable decision making. So it's very important to consider equitable decision making processes and a collaborative approach when we think about systems change and educator pay. And so the way that we conceptualize equity as we evaluated or study these projects is considering the needs of those most impacted through background research. So sort of grouping the projects into one of these buckets, designing project strategies in terms of short-term stakeholder involvement through focus groups or surveys, and then some projects involving those most impacted by the outcomes in terms of long-term stakeholder involvement on their steering committees. And so greater equity really meant to us that there was long-term stakeholder involvement, and it provides an opportunity just for developing systems thinking among the stakeholders and supports the overall advancement of system change and educator pay. And so the development of systems thinking is critical when we think about equity and when we think about how we conceptualize equity and when we think about how we sort of look at how the work on the ground is taking place. Another principle of systems change is system expertise. And this means gaining a shared understanding of ECE systems structure, components, and stakeholders. And so within this particular bucket, the community of practice provided some tools and some training on benefits cliffs. And we've heard Dr. Brittany Birkin's presentation on benefits cliffs, advocacy training, projects just providing more support on how to advocate for more pay and how to educate the public. And then finally, the projects, as already stated, they were informed by national and local research. So I'll turn to just some examples of how the community of practice built system expertise. And so one demonstration project leader said that I've really enjoyed the last training on the benefits cliffs. This is not something I had a granular knowledge on. I appreciate that the COP leadership is so responsive to our needs and gave us a deep dive. And then, but however, building systems expertise in benefits cliffs is not easy. It's still a challenge for many of the groups. And so it's a complex issue, and many of the folks said that it's important to address, but it's not currently as high of a priority as other areas of moving educator pay. And so there's definitely a need for greater education around implementing strategies to address benefits cliffs. As this one provider expressed, I don't want teachers to lose their benefits because I can't afford to pay those benefits. And I don't want to lose the teachers because we have an excellent center and I want to keep it scoring as excellent. And without them, I know I can't do that. Another key area of systems change is strategic accountability. And we define this as developing a system to monitor and assess progress towards systems change. And just as a reminder, when we think about systems change and when we think about monitoring progress, we also have to monitor the progress of our relationship building and how that is occurring across the system and within different systems. So the objectives of strategic accountability is to select indicators and measures that can sort of get at these sort of less explicit ways of building systems change. And so one example is to create a strategic accountability plan to assess and monitor systems change alongside other project outcomes. And so we learned through this first year that a strategic accountability plan is definitely needed to continue to make progress towards systems change on the local level. And finally, nurturing partnerships is key to systems change. And this is basically identifying, building, and sustaining collaborative partnerships at the local and state levels. And this requires engaging actors, partner actors, creating a common purpose and agenda, and building shared accountability. And so an example in practice are demonstration projects. They have cross-sector advisory teams that many of them have these teams that inform their project ongoing. When I talked about equity, I sort of described that some of the projects have this sort of structure. And so cross-sector advisory teams allow different actors from different levels of the system to be involved at the onset of the project, from the development through the implementation. And second, project leaders collaborating together and partnering on initiatives and sharing even outside of the structure of the community of practice also help to nurture partnerships. And so one example that I have here, someone stated, a demonstration project leader said that the community of practice has helped them to know what Ready Start networks are doing. And then a lot of the providers don't know what Ready Start networks are doing. So they gain that information and they can notify the providers and provide more information to their providers. So they found that the community of practice really fostered those connections among the Ready Start networks to get the most accurate information. Finally, all of this adds up to all of these components feed into what we call an ecosystem of capacity, which must be developed at both the state and local levels. And so an ecosystem of capacity is defined as identifying and cultivating a strong network of actors across stakeholder groups. And this is done through centering collective advancement of systems change, through organizing and accountability. And it's also strategically developed through developing systems thinking among all actors and the ability to adapt when challenges arise. And so some examples in practice would be the statewide Louisiana EEIC, as well as Orleans Parish, who's made significant progress on many areas in terms of improving educator pay. And so to revisit the foundational conditions of systems change, I just wanted to sort of revisit this to show that the first level, which are the policies, the practices, and the resource flows, that is often the focus of systems change. And there have been changes in this area in Louisiana and also on the local level. And although it's challenging, it's more explicit work and it's more explicit in its approach, and it has clearer action steps for implementation. However, for systems change, there must be change at all three of these levels, especially relational change, which is less clear. So I want to focus in on relational change in terms of some specific examples from the Louisiana EEIC, which a lot of the learning about how to move the needle on increasing educator pay has occurred. So one example of relational change in practice, well, this is not in practice, this is just some higher level thoughts about relational change and ECE compensation. So it requires building or strengthening cross-sector relationships. And these are some of the things we learned from year one. It requires greater involvement of stakeholders and strategic planning for this involvement. So transparency and clear communication to address the power dynamics and to enhance equity. And then it also involves considering the local ECE system structure and autonomy to drive change, as some of the Ready Start networks were closely aligned with the district, and those sort of relationships had to be navigated in order to enact their strategies to improve pay. And so when we think about how to create this systems change, we've learned that relational change is key for many demonstration projects to make greater progress in their strategies, especially longer term strategies like millages or benefits packages, those sort of things. So if we look at a few examples in practice from the demonstration projects, one suburban district is planning for a millage campaign, and their relational change approach is stakeholder engagement meetings to inform their grassroots campaign. So one of the project leaders stated that they always knew that stakeholder engagement was important, but they did it on a higher level at first. And so after meeting with other community of practice leaders and Ready Start network leaders, it surfaced that we need to dig deeper and schedule more intentional stakeholder meetings to get the broader community on board and see where they are aligned. Now our approach is more structured. So this district realized that a higher level of engagement wasn't going to cut it in terms of really improving educator pay in this particular context, that they needed to dig deeper among the stakeholders, that they needed to engage in one-on-one meetings to really listen to the public, and also to provide any sort of education around the early childhood system in their parish. A second example of relational change in practice is business coaching and peer mentoring that is happening across suburban, rural, and urban parishes in Louisiana. And it surfaced that business coaching is really a need for many early educator providers, that they really need to understand the business side of operating their centers. And so, with this particular project, they provide a community of support for providers and individualized mentoring to improve business operations. And I have three examples here from project leaders and from providers about this particular business coaching. It says that a lot of our providers, a project lead said that a lot of their providers are not at capacity, and that they walk them through the iron triangle to help them to understand how to be at full capacity, to get full tuition all the time. A second perspective from a provider, they stated that they learned very quickly that they didn't know the business side of childcare. And so their one-on-ones and the mentoring the mentoring that's provided through the business coaching is like having an early educator guru at your disposal at all times. And finally, another provider said the in-person meeting with the financial advisor was very helpful to see what we need to pay attention to when it comes to expansion planning and making a business plan that really makes sense to understand what our banks really looking for. So these sort of experiences that providers had with the business coaching help them to improve their operations, or really to understand their business operations and to see their centers as businesses so that they can maximize their current funding streams. And finally, one final example is a suburban district planning for benefits packages and tailoring that support to center providers. So their relational approach is facilitating relationships among HR professionals and center providers to provide benefits offerings. And so what they're doing is providers will receive this individualized coaching focused on workforce strategies to help them create individualized plans based on the resources and existing funding that they have. And so they'll use compensation, benefits, and wellness packages to help them retain staff and possibly increase compensation to a more livable wage. So their strategy is working really with the center providers, piloting this strategy with a few centers, and then learning from this pilot to help other centers in their parish. And so some final key takeaways from year one. So these are early learnings, we're still learning, but final takeaways from what we're understanding around systems change in ECE compensation across the different projects is that it's complex, and it requires a focus on explicit as well as less explicit aspects of change. And those are the relational aspects that we were referring to earlier. Second, it requires flexibility and reflection for continuous learning to inform next steps. It's not always clear cut, and it's not always linear when you're working on these sort of efforts at the local level. Third, it requires building the capacity of local leaders to drive change and not assuming that they have certain types of capacity, in addition to advocating for state policy. And finally, it requires cross-sector relational change, which is critical to making progress in this area. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So now we are in our Q&A portion of the workshop. And I think the first question that I'd like to ask is, well, one, on the findings, I know it's just year one, but was there anything that surprised you initially, just kind of what you saw I mean, for the demonstration projects, or even as it relates to overall what you've seen from other states? Did anything surprise you?
One of the surprising things, and I didn't mention that there are other researchers on this project I do want to acknowledge, Dr. Jesse Chan and Jessica Abram. The thing that surprised us was just how complex, sort of the interaction among the complexity of the early childhood system and the localized strategies that were trying to be implemented. So given the complexity of the system, where some Ready Start networks are positioned a bit closer to the district structure and some have greater autonomy, that sort of impacted their ability to even get their strategies off the ground. So that was pretty surprising, how the structure of the system, and we all know that early childhood is complex. The structures are complex, but we sort of learned how that particular complexity really hindered some of them from really moving the strategies forward on the ground. So really getting that local capacity to move their strategies forward.
Yeah, very true. And then, as you know, the Policy Institute, we actually hosted a regional convening of primarily Southern states around, capacity building, coalition building around early educator compensation. And so, In your research and the work that you guys have looked at, is there a particular state or other region somewhere that is doing it really, really well and just, exceeding this, systems change approach, even if it's not one of the approaches that you're finding here? I'm just curious outside of Louisiana, what you've seen.
Yeah, so we're still really looking into that in terms of from a systems change perspective. So all states seem to be trying to figure it out. So this is really complex work. Can't really point to a particular state right now that's doing something very similar to these very localized strategies, but we are digging into that and hope to have some more to provide in terms of that conversation.
No problem. So what is next? So this was year one. So what is next for this particular study that is ongoing?
Yeah, so next we are providing just more hands-on. Since it's so complex, our strategy has sort of changed and evolved in terms of evaluators. So we're providing a little bit more hands-on support in terms of really digging deep into the projects and understanding their process, not just the outcomes of their strategy. And so that's pretty much next for us, just really digging deep into the process, documenting their process, so that we can continue to learn from the strategies that are being implemented. So we find that that's really important. And then we also are going to use this systems change framework to sort of evaluate their relationship building, because some of the projects have really pivoted towards relationship building in their communities, and they're really strategizing around that. So we're really sort of wanting to measure that, operationalize it, so we can document it and continue to learn how to create systems change in ECE pay.
Absolutely. Question has popped up in the chat. Says it seems like there is not a one size fits all approach to increase compensation in a meaningful way. And so as it relates to the system change that you talked about, where should a community start?
That is a great question. First, I just believe that a community should start with its community, and it should start with listening to the needs of those who are most impacted by this issue. And so, if because this work is so highly contextual, you need to start with those who are most impacted. So, listening sessions are great. Stakeholder mapping is excellent, an excellent way to sort of get your thoughts on paper, sort of learn who the actors are, where they sit in the system. You could even take a system diagram and just sort of fill it out with a few different key actors and sort of build those conversations, start those conversations with your community to understand what your next steps should be. So just like you stated, there is no one size fits all, but the first steps would definitely be listening to the community to understand what is already happening there.
Awesome. It's a great question. Let me see. I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A box. Let me check the other chat. Folks utilize all the tools, which I love. All right. Well, the Q&A box seems to be clear. Any final thoughts or reflections that you'd like to leave us with before we close the session?
Yeah, just want to say I thought that final question was really key to the complexity of this work. And so, not only listening to the stakeholders, but really having systems to document what is being said and to document your learning to create those feedback loops. And also bringing folks to the table who can provide the support to continue to move the work forward. Folks who have systems thinking already at the top of their priority list is really key. So, just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Well, Danica, thank you so much for your expertise and time today. I am really excited to see what comes or what we'll learn from year two of this study. And so, Louisiana really, when we look at what's happening within our early childhood systems, like Louisiana really is ahead of the pack, if you will. And even that was kind of the position I was coming from with my question about like, is there another state doing anything? So, you're kind of highlighting some things that we didn't even realize. So thank you for your work. And again, just looking forward to continued learnings. So thank you all for joining us. When this session ends, it will put you all back in the Zoom event lobby. We have a few minutes before our final closing session. But when I do hit the end Zoom, you will see a pop-up on the top right of your screen. That is our post-session survey. And so please take a moment to complete that for us. It will be as relates to this session in particular. And so you have a few minutes before we jump to our final session. So grab a quick snack or refresh your coffee, and we will